I'm Jesse Owens, and welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations, where we discuss theology, spirituality, ministry, and culture, hopefully in a slightly more informal setting than our normal essays and articles. Today, we're continuing an occasional series where we talk to pastors about their preaching, and they just give us some insight on what their preaching prep looks like, and hopefully that will be beneficial to our listeners. Today, we're delighted to be joined by two pastors and church planters, Daniel Mann and Ed Goode. Daniel's the pastor of Living Hope Free Will Baptist Church in Skokie, Illinois, where he's been for 11 years now. And Ed is at the Bridge Church in Champaign, Illinois, where he's been for about 2.5 years now. So thank you to each of you for joining us today.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I admire both of you guys, and I really appreciate you coming on. And I know you take the task of preaching seriously, so I kind of wanted to get a sense of what your sermon prep looks like. So why don't we start with you just kind of giving our listeners a sense of how long have you been preaching, and do you sense that your preaching has developed or changed over time? And if so, and probably so, how so? So Daniel, let's start with you.
Yeah, so it actually kind of stunned me thinking through this. I've been preaching for nearly 23 years now. I preached my first sermon when I was 15. I was a sophomore in high school. And yeah, it's crazy to think I've been preaching longer than I haven't been in my life. I'm almost 39. So my preaching has definitely changed over time. I would say early on, I was a very topical preacher. David Helms has this great little booklet called Expository Preaching, and a really helpful diagnosis of what my preaching was like early on. He calls it impressionistic preaching, where basically you're reading a text and your initial impression, a thought comes to your mind, and that drives the sermon. And that's really a lot of how my preaching was early on. And then in Bible college, really for the first time, I started learning about different methods of building a sermon, and um, really at that time introduced to expository preaching. And it was such a relief to me in many ways, because I found I didn't really know all the different ways of preaching or methods, but I just knew I was frustrated with how I was going about it, and that it always seemed to be a real struggle to develop the message the way I felt like it should be. And that method of learning in a particular way of expository preaching really helped me, because it helped me to understand better my own personality, I think, in some ways, and then also to really feel like I wasn't straining the text anymore, or trying to squeeze it into something or make it say something it wasn't really saying. So really that was a big shift. And then I found that it's kind of a gradual process. I look back, and even at initially what I thought was expository preaching, I don't think really was, but I was kind of made that turn in college, and then just over time, I think that has come to be more clear about exactly what that would look like for me to be expository preacher. So
Yeah, that's great. And I love the way you say that. It's almost as if there's something freeing when you know your responsibility is to discover the meaning of the text and to preach the text, and isn't maybe dependent upon your initial impression or your own personal creativity and things like that. Ed, how about you? How long have you been preaching, and how has your preaching developed over time?
Yeah, so I preached my first sermon at the University of Surrey at their Christian Union meeting. It would have been October 2006. I was doing a discipleship training program my first year out of college. So preached from, I think, Luke chapter 10. I think 2006 was about 10 years ago, but I guess it was closer to 20 years, right? So like Daniel, just man, what a thrill to think that I've been preaching for almost half my life. I mean,
Hmm.
that's an amazing thought. Yeah, and I'm just glad every day that my early preaching years were before recorded services, before live stream services. So all that is gone forever.
Amen.
Yeah.
But I think similar to Daniel, like I was lucky to be mentored, to be discipled by some guys who had a firm grip on the importance of expository preaching and modeled it and taught me what it was really well. So as far as the form of my preaching, I think is probably obviously grown, but not fundamentally changed in that time. But I think the content and the applicability of it has certainly developed. I think as I've got more comfortable with the text and as I've learned to follow and love the Lord Jesus more, I think those have had big impacts on my own preaching.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so both of you guys pastor church plants. So I don't know. I pastor a church plant as well. And I feel a lot of pressure in preaching that maybe pastoring a plant has to shape how I preach or sermon series in a certain way. Maybe you feel that, or maybe you don't. But I'd love to know. Do you think pastoring a plant shapes your preaching in any way, or should it, or maybe it shouldn't? How do we view what? How do you view what it is you're doing? And does pastoring a plant influence that in any way?
Yeah,
I
that's a
think.
real. Oh, go ahead. You had.
Yeah,
You
go
go.
ahead, Daniel. Go ahead.
Go
I
ahead.
think I think pastoring a church plant, I'm more aware of the sort of the urgency, the necessity to get the vision of what exactly we're doing here out every Sunday. Good friend of mine, John Cannon, says every Sunday is Vision Sunday, right? Like every Sunday, you are bringing people in and bringing people along to the mission of your church plant. Almost every Sunday, I remind people Bridge Church exists to make the real Jesus impossible to ignore in Champaign and beyond. I pastored an established church in Richmond, Virginia, and rightly or wrongly, I didn't feel that pressure there because the vision and the life of the church was sort of baked into 1,000 WAC meetings and men's breakfasts and weddings and funerals, and because we don't have uh, that DNA among us yet, that sort of shared experience yet, I really feel like that has to come more, particularly from the pulpit. If the pulpit is the steering wheel of the church, like I feel like I've got to steer us there every Sunday.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Daniel, how about you?
Yeah, no, it's really well said by Ed. I think I sensed that early on as well, and I still do to this day, that there's a certain heightened awareness of your responsibility for the DNA of the church and the laying the doctrinal theological foundation of the church, because there's no one really behind you that's already laid that. So
Mhm.
I think there's a way in which you feel that more acutely as a planter. Our congregation is very multicultural, and English is not the native language of many of our people. And it seems, just from my conversations and getting to know the people at our church, most of them did not grow up in, like Ed was talking about, and even my own experience, at a very gospel-centered, doctrinally sound church. So one of the things that affects my preaching, I've learned over time that I was taking some things for granted early on that I needed to correct, things like basic Bible knowledge that
Mm.
people would have, or words that I've just assumed that they knew what they meant, or doctrinal concepts, or even background of things that, if you grew up in Sunday school, you would know, but if you didn't, those things are oblivious to you. Like I just preached some messages in Haggai recently, and realized that most of them had no idea that was even a book of the Bible, let alone where it was or anything about it, how to say his name. And one other really quick part of this is, one of the best compliments I ever got was from a lady in our church who stopped me after service a few years ago with her broken English, and she said, "I understood every word that you said
Mm.
clearly." And I felt like that was such a win, if you will, because early I would talk really fast. I don't think I was as aware of how careful I needed to be to make sure I was understood and that everyone was following along. And so that helped me to see I'm making progress in that way, that I'm speaking in a way that people can understand and grasp what the scripture's teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So a lot of pastors are, I don't know, I think many pastors each Sunday maybe are trying to give some thought to what am I going to preach, right? So that's something that goes into the process. So I just want to ask each of you, Ed, we'll start with you. How do you go about developing a sermon series, or how do you determine what you're going to preach each Sunday? How does the whole process even begin?
Yeah, so the end of each year, I try to start in October, November, and start thinking through what it is I'm going to preach on next year. Because I never want to wake up on Monday morning and think, what am I preaching on Sunday? Like I'm just not. Some guys can do that, and that's great. I'm just not built that way. Um, so I try and plan a whole year out. Now we're in mid-May at the moment, and I can already see, I've spent longer preaching through Second Corinthians than I'd planned on. So we're going to have to push back what I've got planned for the second half of this year. But at least I try to be a quarter ahead or 6 months ahead.
Mm.
Um, and as far as what I preach through, I'm always preaching consecutively through, almost always preaching consecutively through books of the Bible. Um, we're preaching through Second Corinthians at the moment, just because here's a church in a state of chaos, and here's Paul reminding these Christians that actually the Christian life doesn't look like strength and victory. It looks a lot like weakness and struggle, and through those things the Lord Jesus prevails in your life. And I just felt like that was a really a particular message for our people at this time. We sometimes it's just I read a book in my own quiet time, in my own devotional time, and I just think, man, I've got to preach this stuff. Like I've got to get into the scriptures deeper and tell my people this good news. Like I followed the McShane plan for my own Bible reading, and just going through Isaiah at the moment, and was just struck this morning by that thought reading Isaiah 11 and 12. So I should imagine we'll visit that section of scripture together before the end of the year. So really, I try and have a long term plan, but I also think, I if when I'm preaching two verses really grab me and stick out, I don't want to rush through them for the sake of my plan. So I try to be a bit more flexible than I want to be, and that's something I'm growing in.
Yeah, I remember a pastor that I really admire. He would say about your personal devotion and the relationship between that and preaching. Let your personal devotion, your personal reading kind of drive you to the pulpit rather than the need to have a sermon to preach be what drives you to the Bible. And so what you're describing there is kind of right on with what he's saying. And I think the best preaching is when our personal devotion is what drives us to the pulpit rather than the other way around, for sure. Daniel, how about you? How do you determine what you're going to preach? Maybe planning your preaching, sermon series, things like that.
Yeah, the first couple years of our church plant, I preached through various themes or um, distinctives, or kind of trying to lay a foundation of what is a New Testament church, and various things like that. And then probably around 2015, 2016, and I wish it would have started earlier, but I really sensed the need to start preaching through books of the Bible. That's not something I really grew up under or had a whole lot of experience around. So it was somewhat new to me. I was reading a number of things I found really, really helpful. So what we've been doing for the past probably 7 or 8 years is preaching directly through books of the Bible and then alternating between the testaments. So right now I'm in um, right now I'm in Genesis, and so we'll have a series of messages from that, and then we'll go to the New Testament. I'll be in Second Thessalonians in a few weeks. And also, Mark Dever has this plan that he's laid out. There's a number of people that do this, where he not only shifts between the testaments, but also through the various genres of the Bible. And I've just found that such a blessing to me personally, and I think our church has as well, because I kind of have described it to the church as a well-balanced diet, because we all are prone to wanting, steak every meal, or wanting ice cream after dinner every time, and not having a healthy, balanced meal. And so going to the Psalms or the poetic books of the Bible, and then going to a gospel account, and then to a historical book of the Bible, and then one of Paul's letters, I find that it helps in so many ways to meet the needs of the congregation. And it helps to see that these various ways in which God is speaking to us, and the various means in which he's done that in his word, can be given to us. So, like Ed, usually end of the year, first of the year, I plan out the next 12 months about what books of the Bible I'm going to be preaching through, and how many weeks I think it's going to take me. If it's an exceptionally long book of the Bible, I will break it up like I have with Genesis. It'll probably take me 4 years or so to do that, because I've broken it up into several different segments. So, and then, but probably through 2017, I've got at least the books of the Bible that I want to preach through, and kind of how I want that to look throughout those different years. But when we start a series, one of the things I love to do is to start with an overview sermon. So if it's Second Thessalonians, and that, I wish I would have learned that earlier, because one of my biggest frustrations when I first started preaching through books of the Bible is I would be so excited for that first message, that first passage, and I'd already read through the book, but I didn't have a really good grasp of how it all came together. And so it was almost like I was building the plane while it was in the air.
Yeah.
And that overview sermon has allowed me to build the plane before I take off, so I kind of know where this is all going. And I've just found those overview sermons have really helped me, and I think it's helped our church too, to kind of, okay, this is where all this is going. This is why this book of the Bible is in Scripture. This is why we need it. So anyway, I'd really commend that to anyone who's considering that path.
Yeah, that's beneficial to you and to the hearer, to give them a sense of where things are going, but also to you to kind of make sure that you've kind of begun to wrap your mind around what's happening here. That's so funny that you say that, though. It is so possible to preach expositionally through a book of the Bible, have read it, have really given it some thought, but then kind of still feel like you're building the plane as you're moving through. And that's maybe somewhat inevitable, right? That still happens somewhat. But it's kind of like writing out even a sermon manuscript, whether you take it into the pulpit with you or not. If you just have bullet points on a page, you may not have really developed that thought. But if you forced yourself to write things out, you at least have had to kind of develop the thought a little bit. And what you said about genres, that's so good too. That's something that someone introduced me to early on, not just moving back and forth between the testaments, but realizing there's historical narrative in the Old Testament, there's historical narrative in the New Testament, but preaching historical narrative in the Old and the New might have more similarities than dissimilarities. But preaching the Psalms or the Proverbs, as opposed to any sort of historical narrative, that's a very different type of preaching. So thank you for those insights. That's really good. Okay, Daniel, so you said you're preaching through Genesis now. Okay, so I don't know where you're at in Genesis, but you have your next sermon coming up for Sunday. Today is Monday when we're recording this. What is the prep schedule look like? What does the weekly sermon development look like? Maybe you've done some things already in advance, but on an ideal week, what does your sermon prep look like?
Yeah, so right now I'm in the middle of Genesis, really covering the life of Jacob from really about Genesis 25 till Genesis 36, Isaac and Jacob. And I usually start on Tuesday morning. If I can, I like to get some prep started on Monday, but that typically it starts for me on Tuesday. I love the method that Wayne McDill lays out in his book, 12 Essential Steps. Now I'm going to confess I don't go through all 12 steps. usually every week. But so many of the insights that he shares in that book, which is probably 30 years old now, maybe it's had a few additions to it, but it really has developed me as a preacher and really in my study. So if it's appropriate to the passage, I'll diagram it, is kind of how I begin. If not, I go through with reading the text carefully, making observations, and I'll move to some investigative questions where I'm trying to ask things about it that I don't understand, places, names, terms, what's the theological thrust going on here? And then I'll try to outline it from an exegetical standpoint, like how does the passage break down? And to me, the hardest part of it all, and really, what the real most difficult work is to find that textual and sermon idea of what in one clear sentence, what is the main idea of this passage. And really I can't get to the body of my sermon until I have that. So that's where I find so many of my moments spent really trying to think through that and come to a grip to, and all the observations and questions and outline, all of that is trying to lead me to that point. And then once I have that, Wayne McDill, one of the things he's done for me in that book is, he argues that every point, ideally should have, kind of at least four elements, right? Explanation, illustration, argumentation, and application. Now, I'm not saying I always do that every single time, but he does make a really good case for that. And so I have, kind of a template laid out where as I'm building my sermon and I have my main idea, and then I find the way that's divided out through the text where I'm going through that, I try to go through those four elements, explain it, and then illustrate it, argue its plausibility, and then apply it. And so each point I seek to have those elements to it. So,
Okay, great. Ed, tell us a little bit about your ideal week for sermon prep. Not when all the other things kind of get in the way and mess up your schedule. What does an ideal week of sermon prep look like?
It's amazing what we talked about earlier, thinking about how many years it's been since I preached my first sermon. I still tend to wake up on Monday morning and think, how do I do this? Like how does this happen? How do I get from passage to
Mm,
preaching? But so that's why I love having a structure, right? Because it helps me know where I'm at and where I'm going. So Monday, it's pretty much just me and a study Bible and a notebook, and I'm just reading and writing most of the day. I'm just writing down everything I can think of, everything that stands out to me, everything that comes out of that passage to me on Monday morning goes in a notebook. And 60% of that stuff never goes any further. A lot of it I'll open my notebook on Tuesday morning and it's garbage, right? But at least it's kind of gone through my mind. So Monday is kind of just disorganized, disconnected, and then Tuesday I'll do my kind of commentary work, and by the end of Tuesday, um, I like to have an outline. I like to have kind of a theme sentence, right? Like something that unifies this passage, and from that theme sentence will normally come the point of my message, like the thing I repeat over and over again on Sunday morning, the one thing I want people to take away with them. I like to have that on Tuesdays, but often what I have for my theme on Tuesday is different from where I arrive at on Sunday. And then Wednesday, I take all that and I write a full manuscript on Wednesdays, and that helps me to know that I've paid attention to the text, and it helps me to slow down. It helps me to often kind of craft some individual sentences that take a little bit more thought than I would have just from bullet points. And then Thursday, Friday, I take that manuscript and into the pulpit with me. I just take headings and key sentences, right? So I take that 1,600 word manuscript and I try to get it on one piece of paper, and that's like I say, headings, key sentences, and normally a fully written introduction and conclusion. And normally you can draw a straight line from between where I was on Monday and where I get to on Friday. Sometimes it's like two different people have had a go at it. But that's, and so I take those bullet points into the pulpit with me Sunday, and that helps me know, okay, I've got some things that I absolutely want to say, but I've
Mm,
also got some liberty to say, to expand on things that seem to be hitting home to the people that I'm preaching to.
yeah, yeah, that's good. Okay, Ed, so you mentioned commentaries. So we'll start with you on this. Thinking about commentaries, finding commentaries, or other sorts of sermon helps. What do you use? How do you determine what to use? Those sorts of things. How do you choose commentaries? Do you try to choose some older commentaries, something by Puritans or something even older, or do you read mostly new? How does that work? And before you answer that, Ed, I want to say to those who are listening, I think Ed might be the only person I've ever talked to, at least among Free Will Baptists that I can think of, that's ever told me that they had a reading plan for reading through Calvin's Institutes. So I fully expect that you're going to tell me that you're reading some older commentaries. But how do you choose sermon help, sermon resources?
Listen, can I say everyone should read Calvin's Institutes?
I
I
agree.
mean,
Hey, I agree.
you know,
You don't have to convince me.
let's chew the meat and spit the bones out. Um, but yeah. So obviously, it depends on which book of the Bible I'm preaching on or which testament I'm in. Don Carson has a really helpful book that's basically a commentary on commentaries, right? It kind of lists the helpful commentaries, and so you're not kind of wasting time trying to work through that. So I depend on that. New Testament, I depend a lot on John MacArthur, some other guys. I've always got a Matthew Henry commentary kind of within reach, just because I enjoy him, just because there's a warmth and maybe it's not the most rigorous technical work, but there's a warmth and a sort of a depth of observation in him that I really enjoy. I also use Don Carson and G.K. Beale have a book, The Use of the Old Testament in the New Testament,
Yeah.
and that's fantastic. Like I find that so insightful. So those are my kind of my pole stars of commentaries, and then depending on what book I'm in or what's been recommended to me, I do love older commentaries. When I was preaching through John's Gospel earlier in the year, uh, someone recommended to me John Chrysostom's homilies on John's Gospel, which is third or fourth century, just may as well be on a different planet. But again, like, and their blind spots are different from our blind spots, right? Like, that's why I appreciate older works, because the things that I miss are different from the things that they miss.
Mm.
So I always try to get out of my own century a little bit, and then towards the end of the week, if Spurgeon or Edwards or those guys have preached on that passage, I try to read it. I try to have my own work 90% done before I do that, because otherwise I'm just going to preach what those guys
Yeah.
say. That's
Yeah.
and that can be super helpful. It can be massively discouraging. So
Mm.
I used to do that Saturday night, but it just made me want to quit every Saturday night. So now I do it slightly earlier in the week, kind of towards the end of my prep time. But
It has to be later in the process, but that makes sense. Not too late.
not
Later in
too
the
late.
process, because if it's too early, I'm just going to want to say what Spurgeon says. But if I'm reading it on Saturday night, I think I'm such a terrible preacher. Why? Why even bother?
Yeah, why
Why
even
even
bother?
bother?
Yeah, exactly.
Daniel, tell us about what sort of sermon resources you use, and I think commentaries, older, new, other resources that you use. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I should probably back up really quickly to say, I try to get started on Tuesdays, and then most mornings, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, until about noon, I'm working on that. Want my textual sermon idea to be ready by Wednesday, but I'm still building the sermon, usually till well into Friday, to get it all finished. Um, to find commentaries, like I've not found it helpful to buy a whole collection. I know that can be, but to buy all of Baker exegetical, or, the Tyndale Old Testament or New Testament, to me, that's not been the most effective approach. There's a couple trusted sites that I have relied on, and they've proven to be reliable. Tim Chalice has a website or a blog where he's got the top commentaries for, in his opinion, for each book of the Bible. Ligonier has something like that. I think even Logos does. And so if I'm preaching through a book a few weeks or so, a month beforehand, I'll go on there and look and see what are the best recommended ones, and I'll see how many of those rank them high, and I'll try to pick up 2 or 3 of those. Um, Now, when it comes to the week of, and I'm working on a sermon, I try to prioritize early in the week the technical and exegetical commentaries early
Mm.
on. For one thing, like Ed was saying, because those don't tend to um, influence my outline, or, this is a catchy way of saying that, or, like the Spurgeon or the Edwards, that's just going to have a sermon that just dwarfs mine and to discourage me. But they will help me to get a handle on some things that I'm struggling to understand about the text, and to make sure that I'm not just completely off base, just going off into left field. And so I try to avoid those devotional or expositional commentaries until later on during the week. But I do find, like, a lot of the Baker exegetical commentaries, I mentioned Tyndale, those are good. And honestly, my favorite, if it's a New Testament, I mean, this is a plug to Randall House. We need to get some Old Testament work done. But I love the Randall House commentaries. I really do. I don't ever preach through a New Testament book without heavily reading, using, and I love the way it's laid out. It's a unique layout of commentaries, and I've read a lot of them where they have the teaching and application at the end, and they really emphasize that. And I think that's helpful in the process. So if it's something that is a really challenging aspect of the text, I'll try to find some good journal articles on it where you can really think through the issues and what is going on in all this. And then those expositional and devotional commentaries I find are so useful for me in illustrations if I'm looking
Mm.
for something to really draw home an application. A lot of times my introduction and conclusion will be heavily influenced by some of those devotional commentaries, like a Warren Wiersbe, for instance, that, he's not going to dig into, a lot of the nitty-gritty of the passage, but he has a great way of framing things that the common person, can really latch onto. And I will say too, kind of like I don't read, as far as regularly in my study, a lot of older commentary, like Puritans.
Mm.
They're quoted a lot in the commentaries that I use, so I do find their work valuable. I just don't have access to a lot of those and use them regularly. But similar to what Ed was saying about, avoiding reading Spurgeon or Edwards or someone too early. What I like to do a lot of times on Saturday while I'm like walking around, like it's Saturday night or something, or um, is to listen to the sermon from the passage that I'm preaching on from somebody else, because it may give me, another way of thinking about it, or another aspect of an application or a quote or a way to start or conclude this message that I found to be really helpful. And it's late enough in the process to where I'm not tempted to take their whole message. So that's worked for me as far as a resource.
I'm encouraged to hear you say that because I do something similar to that. And then sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilty about it. But basically, if Alistair Begg or Sinclair Ferguson or a couple of others have preached a sermon on the text, I usually want to listen to at least one of those, but later in the process, because like you said, there's a way that they say something, or there's something that they point out that I might have overlooked, or maybe they say it in a more compelling way, and that can be really helpful as well. I think you're so right, though. Buying series of commentaries doesn't typically, maybe isn't the best way of buying commentaries. Usually, buying the best commentaries based on that book of the Bible tends to be. I maybe have had the most success in buying commentaries in that way. But a lot of guys just I think maybe have a set or have just Barnes Notes or just Matthew Henry or things like that. And there's so many good resources out there, and that's not to detract from any of those. Like Ed has mentioned, Matthew Henry has great stuff. But at the same time, there are a lot of other great resources out there that can aid us as well. Tell me about your other reading habits. You guys just you just read the Bible and commentaries all the time, right? That's all you do, or do you read other things? And do you find that reading other things aids you in your preaching, in your sermon development, in any way? Reading biographies or poetry or fiction or anything like that. Ed, tell us, does reading outside of sermon prep aid your preaching, and if so, how so?
Yeah, I think reading outside of your sermon prep is a necessary aid to sermon prep, and I think that's true of I think that's true generally, and I think that can be true uh, particularly. So I read some, try to mix between theology and biography and fiction. Um, so I just finished James Smith's new book on inhabiting time. A whole bunch of stuff in there I didn't find at all helpful, but one or two things that is really gonna change the way I approach. And it's not a book about preaching or ministry at all, but a few things that will help me relate to people differently and just think through things differently. And that's mostly what I'm looking for when I read a theology book or a ministry book. John Piper said something like, books don't change your life, sentences change your life.
Mm.
So I'm just looking for that kind of that one thought that I'm gonna just pump into my life and my ministry. I love reading biography because for two reasons. Number one, it's just so inspiring, and it's so encouraging to see what God does with weak, struggling people throughout history. I love seeing the work of God through history and living downstream of that. And I love reading fiction. I mean, for for years and years, really probably until 2013, 2014, somewhere around then, I made the mistake of thinking that ministry's too important and life's too short to waste time with fiction. Um, but man, I just think life is too short not to read good fiction. You know, I think that if you've never sat down and read Lord of the Rings, like maybe something missing from your preaching, right? And
Mm.
that's not because I'm going to go out there and preach like Gandalf, but it's because there's a heroism and a depth and a joy and a beauty in the way Tolkien and Lewis and Leif Enger and some other kind of slightly more modern guys write that I think helps me craft sentences and express thoughts, right? And if preaching is if our job is using words to express thoughts, let's spend time with people who are really good at using words to express
Yeah.
thoughts, who are great at conjuring up words and images. And I think fiction also helps. I'm reading The Bonfire of the Vanities at the moment, which is about like mega rich Wall Street financiers in the late 80s. And it's just an extended meditation on the love of money is the root of all kind of evil, right?
Mm.
Now, Wall Street in the 80s, that's a million miles removed from anything I've ever experienced. But through that fiction, I can experience it. Through the Power and the Glory by Graham Greene, I can be encouraged by a minister who feels like he's wasted his whole life, and at the end, everything turns out and it's great. So um, yeah, fiction's a gift of common grace that I don't think we should overlook.
Yeah, that's good. And I think a lot of pastors find it difficult. Maybe they're just not voracious readers. And I think that's something we have to kind of teach ourselves to do. If we're not, something we have to force ourselves to learn. And like you said, learning from others who are good at crafting sentences and developing ideas. I mean, we traffic in the realm of words and of communication. And so learning from others, whether we're doing it in biography or fiction or whatever it might be, can be extremely helpful. Daniel, how does your reading outside of sermon prep and things like that? How does your reading aid you, do you think, in your preaching? And if it does, how so?
Yeah, I'm really glad you started with Ed on this because I feel like he at this point is just much more broadly read, or he's um I'm drawing from the cliff notes from his Twitter page, on a lot of these great books.
Yeah, we just read Ed's Twitter page for
You get
for
the cliff
our sermon
notes.
prep. Yeah.
He's I call him the Free Will Baptist, Martin Lloyd Jones, and he's a little bit of a C.S. Lewis mixed in there. So we are blessed in that regard with him. Um, you know, I'm kind of in a season right now where my current academic obligations, I don't have a lot of time to read some of the things that I would want to when it comes to fiction and biographies in particular. And I have found them so valuable, and I'm drawing from some of the past, but in this current season, I'm not doing a lot of that in the moment. I'm finding a lot of my time is spent with um, really not even as much commentaries as much as it is monographs of books of the Bible, of journal articles, um, background reading, rhetorical, literary aspects and issues of the Bible. And I've found that to be um, really incredibly helpful. It's in my preaching. It's helped me to understand um, things before that I was just completely oblivious to, whether there was a particular way that the psalmist is structuring this psalm that I just completely was blind to and just reading it, along, or the way that Paul might use an ancient metaphor that, to me, I had it in mind that it meant this, and I'm thinking about it from, my perspective, the 21st century, and then understanding it. This is what his readers would have um, drawn from that. So that's a lot of my reading right now, and um, I I do resonate so much with what Ed is talking about, though, because there is something life-giving about going back to a biography from 200 or 300 years ago, or reading a book that's just completely kind of
Mm.
out of what is ordinary or usual in our current cultural climax. And one more thing I would add to this, it's not necessarily something that I read every week, but I find almost every message that I preach, an ancient hymn finds its way in there.
Mm.
I don't know what it is, but part of it's growing up in, gospel-centered church, but I feel like I have, if you take the old like Rejoice Free Will Baptist hymn book, like I have in my mind, you know, probably memorized so many verses of ancient hymns, and I don't. I oftentimes find that coming out in the message, and then at Living Hope, we're really intentional about the music that we sing as a congregation. A lot of times, if it's a newer hymn or newer song, or even if it's an older hymn or song, we'll sing it 4, 5, 6 weeks in a row so that people learn it. And then if my passage in any way connects with that, I'll bring that up in the message. If we're singing "In Christ Alone, My Hope Is Found,"
Mm.
Mm.
and He is my light, my strength, my song, and I'm preaching through one of the Psalms where David says, "The Lord is my light, the Lord is my strength," and I'll say, "We sang that this morning. This is why we have these kinds of songs, because it helps to saturate and soak our minds in the Word." So I find that. Really the words of those really biblically saturated, whether modern or ancient hymns and music, really helps me in preaching. It really helps me to see how that this truth is not just a proposition. It's more than that. It is something that stirs the heart, and people have put music to this because of the great meaning that it has for our lives. So anyway, that's
Yeah,
something that is my preaching every week.
that's a great insight. People always joke about sermons being like 3 points in a poem or 3 points in a hymn, but there's something about that, and so weaving that into our gathered worship, whether it's including that song or it's referencing those hymns, can be incredibly powerful. And I would say regarding hymns and music and their relationship to poetry and even the Psalms. Um, it connects with us, I think, at a deeper, maybe a more embodied level than sometimes propositional statements or ideas that we're just trying to convey. They hit us at a more core level, and I think that's really wise to think about how hymnody fits into our preaching as well.
And
Um,
I wanted to just add really quick, I'm really passionate about trying to help people understand the words that we're singing. And I've learned it about myself. First of all, I learned this about me, and then I think, well, other people must be struggling. There's a lot of the songs we grew up singing. I didn't quite understand all of it, like the love of God, the guilty pair bowed down with care. God gave his son to win, and I don't know how many people I've talked to about that and said, that's Adam and Eve, right? This is about Adam and Eve, and it's about our lives. And so just those ways, Adrian Rogers used to do that. And I used to deliver Domino's pizza for a year or so before moving here. And I would listen to a lot of Adrian Rogers preaching. And he would always seem, or a lot of times would seem to quote an ancient hymn. And I just found that so impactful for me. So anyway, sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to throw.
no, that's excellent. Adrian
Alistair Begg,
Rogers.
Alistair Begg does that too, right? So it must be good.
Yes, he does.
Adrian Rogers preaching does two things for me. One, it encourages me and edifies me, and it also makes me think I will never be able to preach like that. It's like it's both of those things at the same time. I simultaneously think, wow, that is so helpful, and I will never be that good at this, but that's okay. I used to occasionally look at, not as much now, John Phillips commentaries. And when I would look at John Phillips commentaries, I felt that way about the way that he would outline the text. I would think, yeah, I'll never come up with anything that is remotely like close to that. So I'm sort of doomed. A part of me wants to ask, what is the most hard or what most difficult part of sermon prep? Sometimes people would say introductions or conclusions or application or illustration, but maybe we'll just stick with application. And how do you think about applying the text? So in the process of sermon writing, how do you think about applying what it is you're going to preach? Do you envision your audience and kind of think, oh, those people sit there and this could affect them in that way? Do you have something more developed? I've seen sermon application grids that people use. How do you think through applying the text? Ed, let's start with you.
So I was really struck reading through First Thessalonians a couple of weeks ago. First Thessalonians chapter 5, Paul talks about I've lost it now, of course. Admonish the idle, strengthen the weak, encourage the faint-hearted. Right, and a lot of application is figuring out a lot of ministry is figuring out who's in which category, and a lot of application is figuring out what can I say here that's encouraging, what can I say here that's admonishing, what can I say here that's strengthening. I think one of the purposes of gathered worship is to unlearn the false gospel we teach ourselves during the week as we open the Bible together. So, had a kid in my youth group in Greenville years ago tell me that all my sermons are the same. Jesus died for our sins, so we should trust him. I'm like, hey kid, you've got it. That's it. You've graduated from teen church. Congratulations. Um, but I mean, application is just trying to say that in a slightly different way each week, and I try to picture people in our congregation, like what do I say to what in this passage is going to keep the special needs mum going this week? What in this passage is going to keep the young family going this week? What in this passage is going to encourage the factory worker in my church who reads Augustine on his lunch break? Like what in here is going to feed him this week? And I find that so helpful because often so much of our sermon prep happens in our heads. Like actually thinking about people helps me to get it out of my head a little bit better. And then just knowing your people, right? Like Paul
Yeah.
tells us to pastor the flock of God that's among us. Like go and
Mhm.
be with those people during the week. Go and listen to them. Go and find out about that struggle. Go and learn. Man, life is complicated and spiritual growth isn't linear, right? Like, and I've found the more I get to know the people that I minister to, actually the easier application gets. Not even necessarily in a particular one for one way, but just in a almost in a thematic way. Like, four people have told me a variation of this struggle this week. Therefore, here's something that people in Champaign need to hear about: the claims of the Lord Jesus on their life. So I find that very helpful.
Yeah. Thinking about investing in people's lives, and the more you're involved in their life, the more you know what they're struggling with, the easier it is to apply that text to them. That's a really helpful insight. And then thinking about preaching as shepherding, right? Thinking about how to apply this text to these people. That is part of shepherding. It's not a a theological lecture. We might deal with theological issues and topics, but we're trying to shepherd people through what we're saying. That's very helpful. Uh, Daniel, you mentioned earlier that you have kind of a diverse congregation. How do you think through application and with a diverse congregation, how do you think about the different groups of people, maybe different experiences, and applying that text across a diverse group of people?
Yeah, I found that trying to understand, people's fears is one of the best ways of thinking through application because so many of the people at our church, they grew up very culturally different than I did, and they still have family and ties to their country of origin. And so, often they'll tell me about some kind of political uprising, or a few years ago we had some families in Cameroon that were, seeing some very violent, scary activity going on very close to the village where they had families at. And so trying to think through that during the week, and as I'm reading my passage and planning this out, how is this how's this connect to what my people are afraid of, or what they're facing right now, what they are discouraged about, what questions they have, like Ed said, going through that, the single mom, the widower that's coming to the church, the college student who, just coming here so he can tell his mom and dad that he went to church, today, and just, trying to think through all those different groups and how does this connect. One of the things that has changed about the way I guess take on application and preaching is I'm tempted, and I think, in American society in particular, we're tempted with this, to think of it only in an individual realm. So I've had to kind of retrain myself to, we always have individual application, how this passage affects you personally. But then I always try to think through us as a church, because so much of the Bible is written in, plural form. It's addressed to a body of people. So how does this affect us as a congregation, not just as an individual? And trying to think through that with the church, because I find that most of us are if we're sensitive to the Spirit's leading and hungry at all to develop in our relationship with Christ, we're already thinking on an individual level, and we need help guiding us in that way. But that's more natural to us. What's not as natural is, how does this affect us together? What is our life as a church? How is it impacted by this truth? And then I think I also used to think of application a lot more of practical do's, of practical action. And I still try to incorporate that in my message. But I'm learning there's a lot of passages where the call is not actually to do something in a 1, 2, 3 step, as much as it is to believe something, to see something, to understand something. And so I always try to find, how is this passage connected to Christ? How is it pointing us to what Christ has done, what God has done through his son, and try to make sure my people see that, more than this passage is designed to help you have a better marriage or to get through Monday tomorrow. Although, and I always say it will help you. I hope it does, and it can. But more than that, this is to help you know God. It's to help you understand Christ, and to really point that out to them and apply that. This is how God wants you to see his son through this passage. And I make that a big part of my application every week.
It has
And
me
I think
thinking we need to do an episode on how do you develop Christ-centered sermons. So that's good.
Have
And
you read the book called your Old Testament sermon needs to get saved.
I have that, which is great. That's a non-Marx book that's come out within the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's great.
That is good. Ed, what were you going to add?
Well, I was going to say, I think Daniel has hit on something so important in our application. You know, that the Christian faith is only secondarily do. The Christian faith
Mm,
primarily is be and believe, and we need to model that from the pulpit like our life depends on it. But that's a long-term project with most people, because most people are watching guys on YouTube or
mm,
have come out of a church where the whole message is, here's 3 steps to heal your marriage by Tuesday, right? And like Daniel says, man, yeah, I want to help your marriage, but I want to tell you things that are going to be useful to you in a million years.
mm,
So
mm.
let's do that together. So I think that's so important, and that's a struggle I find. Like I want people to go away. I'm tempted to give people something to do, because then they're leaving with something tangible. But often the tangible is not the most useful.
Yeah. Yeah, we want to give them those 3 steps, but like Daniel was saying, sometimes it's thinking differently
Mm.
about who God is or a particular doctrine. So it's not always just go do these things or go do this one thing. Sometimes it is changing the way we think about a particular thing. And so there's a much broader approach to application than we often think of. Well, we'll have to save the Christ-centered exposition for another episode. I hope you all will maybe join us for that. But thank you so much for sharing what your sermon prep looks like each week. I trust this will be beneficial to those who listen. I thank you for your faithfulness in preaching, and I appreciate you all coming on. Thank you to our viewers for listening to another episode of HSF Conversations.